We're back. Happy half hour, season 2 Sip Trips, episode 4. We are live. Waiting for the check-ins, waiting for a little bit of clapping. See the clapping. I have to get the applause sign back out again, I'm thinking. So let's see who we have checking in. Oh, so far we have 1,000 viewers, 2,000. Hi, Diane Andrews and John. So faithful every week. Very good to see you. Let's see who else. Jason, yay! Jason, it's party night for you. You can't be watching us. All right, 10,000 people now. There's Karen clapping. Everybody's paying good attention. Yay, Foskey Murray's in the house. Hi, Jimmy. All right, I'm going to turn it over. Hi, Virginia Wine Time, to Al and Cheryl.
Are we on now?
Yes, we're on.
Well, thank you all again so much for joining us here at Sip Trip number 4. And especially, more importantly, thanks for all the support you've been giving us during these critical times. It's so nice that we're still active and everything is running smoothly. Last week we had a chance to learn a little bit about how enjoying wine. As you know, today we're back into production. And as you can also see, we're in the tank room, so we'll be talking a little bit about that in a moment. Weather has become a really big issue this year, and just to footnote it, there's a little story I'd like to start off with. This director in Arizona was in the process of putting on a movie, and one day an old Indian came up and said to him, "No film tomorrow, rain." And sure enough, in the middle of the desert, they had a big rainstorm. A couple of days later, the old Indian shows up again and said, "No film tomorrow, big storm." And unbelievably, the next day, they had a terrible hailstorm. The producer was so intrigued about this that he went out and he hired the old Indian to give him forecasts on a regular basis. And he was extremely successful. Then all of a sudden, one day, he stopped showing up. He wasn't there for about 2 weeks, and the director knew he had a very big production scene coming up the next day, so he went out and sent one of his helpers to find the old Indian. The old Indian was brought to him, and he said, "I have a big production. What's the weather like tomorrow?" And he said, "Me not know. Radio broke." Yay! With that, tonight's featured wine is our Victorian White. So let me see if I can again pour us a sample here. Cheryl, would you get your 2 glasses? We're still in a state of coronavirus, as you can see.
State of coronavirus.
Or whatever. Do I see a magic glass coming forward? Ah, yes I do. Amy's a strong believer in never drinking alone. That's why she always has little children with her. Now, a little bit about the wine. As you know, we produce 3 Chardonnays. 2 of them are barrel fermented and aged in French oak. What we're having today is a stainless steel Chardonnay. This has been cold fermented in the tanks directly behind me, using a German yeast, which is designed to bring out a much fruitier character to this wine. It does have a hint of residual sugar, and of course we're going to be talking a little bit about that later on when we talk about the tanks. This makes a very nice sipping wine, a nice springtime wine or summer wine, and again, without the oak, you're really concentrating on the character of the grape. So with that, here's to you all, and here's to the Victorian White. Wow, is that a good wine? Now, moving right along. This has been a very, very busy, I see, is there a question?
How has Cheryl's week been?
I'm very glad you asked that, because that was going to be my very next question. So with that, we've had a very busy week. Cheryl, would you briefly update people on your week? makes a statement on how that week has gone. Thank you again, Cheryl, for your update. Now a little bit about an update on the vineyard. I know everyone's really concerned about what's going on. As you know, I took samples of the Saval and the Gewürztraminer this past week. The Saval, it was the second sample. It's moved 2.5 bricks, which means it's moving right along very well. Tomorrow, on Monday, we will add the Vidal Blanc to the sampling. By that time, I should have a pretty good feel for when the Saval is going to be coming in. Right now, it's the lead wine like it always has been. The vineyards look very healthy. The only problem we're having is there's a little bit of animal damage, and as a result, we're working on that problem to try to solve it. Now let's start talking about what we're really here for today, and that's the tank room. A very, very important segment of making wine. The tank room, basically there are two types of stainless steel tanks. There's tanks that are designed for red wine, and tanks that are designed for white wine. A red wine tank will always have two manways. One slightly elevated, the other one level with the base of the tank. In most instances, the red wine tank also has a flat base. The reason for the two manways is once fermentation is completed in a red wine tank, the stems or the seeds and the skins will collapse to the bottom. Once the wine is drained out of that tank, we have to have a way of getting those solids out. And that's why the lower manway has been put online. The two tanks directly behind me are white wine tanks. And as you'll note, there's only a single manway, and it's up about 12 to 18 inches above the base of a tank. Now, what I'm going to do is walk you through what a tank actually consists of. It's a little more complex than what you would actually consider. There's a number of parts to a tank. Of course, the basic tank is what's holding the wine. But you have the manway, the door that's going to close the manway, the gaskets, which are the black rubber instrument which gives the seal. You have a racking valve, which is directly below the manway, but is above the base of the tank. You also have a draining valve, which allows us to empty the tank completely. All of our tanks have sight lines, which gives us the ability to actually see how much wine is in that tank at any given time. All of our tanks have a sample valve, so that during the course of fermentation or further processing, we can actually pull a sample of the wine directly from the tank. They all have thermostats, or thermometers, so we can monitor the temperatures of these tanks. And that's a very critical element we'll talk about in a moment. All tanks have also what's classified a volume plate, which indicates how much wine is in each inch of the tank, and then what is in the dish. And also, we're able to put a label on this tank so that it identifies what particular wine is in any given tank at any given time. The two other elements of a tank are the dish, which is the circular base, allowing the sediment, the lees, to settle to the bottom, and also the dome. The dome is the top of the tank, which gives us a little bit of airspace, so when we're fermenting, the carbon dioxide will have a place to accumulate rather than pushing the wine out. At the very top of the dome is the airlock. And I have one down here that I'm going to show you. Every tank will have an airlock. These are stainless steel. They're made in Germany. They allow the CO2 to escape via the valve, but when the tank is being emptied, there's a spring that allows air to go back into the tank so that we don't end up pulling a vacuum and collapsing the tank. You're going to also note that every tank has a jacket around the outside of this tank. This allows us to move coolant around the edge, which keeps the wine chilled while we're in the process of fermenting. If we were to walk around the back of the tank, we would note that there's an entry port and an exit port for the coolant to circulate into the tank. And a part of the lines that go into it are actual valves that allow us to control the flow of the coolant and therefore be able to control the temperatures of the tank. The other elements that are extremely important, of course, we've had the cooling line. Well, that pretty much takes us through the rest of the parts of the tank. Now, what is the configuration of a tank, or of a tank room? I think I'm going to go ahead and sit back down so we can talk a little bit about that directly. It also gets me a lot closer to my glass of wine. When you are in our tank room, one of the first things you're going to know is that the tanks are in various sizes. We have 4 sizes of tanks in the tank room, ranging from a little over 1,000 gallons for our largest tanks to about 280 gallons for our smallest tanks. You'll also note in the tank room that there's no time where you'll have just a single size tank. You always have to have at least 2 of a particular tank. Why 2? One tank always has to be empty. During the course of winemaking, there's going to be periods of time that we have to rack or move wine from one tank to another. If all of the tanks are full, it's impossible to move the wine. Now, I see we may have some questions here.
So let's start when you're talking about racking, because Paula Dickinson asked, is there residue in the tanks, or basically, is there sediment in the tanks? And if so, what do you do with that?
Paula, that's a great question. The whole purpose of racking is to get the clear wine off the sediment or lees. And yes, that sediment is in the base of the tank. The lees, of course, are the dead yeast cells that have fallen out after fermentation. As a result, that will be removed, allow any clear wine to settle, and then the lees will be either composted or spread back into the vineyard, allowing the wild yeast now to take over, or the cultured yeast to take over from the wild yeast.
Barbara Allen asked, what is the makeup of the coolant?
Coolant is food-grade glycol, which basically circulates outside the tank and never comes in contact with the wine. And the glycol that we use gives us the ability to drop the temperatures as low as 0 or actually slightly below 0 centigrade. Now, going back to the configuration in the tank room, as I mentioned, you always have to have at least 2 tanks to give us the ability to move wine. Therefore, when you're looking at a tank room, you're looking at tanks that are normally, half of them will be filled, or more than half will be filled, but there'll always be at least 1 tank of each size empty. The only exception here is we have only 1 red wine tank. It's a 1,000-gallon tank designed for fermenting our Cabernet Sauvignons. Because we small lot ferment most of our reds, the reds are normally fermented in fiberglass bins that are covered with lids to protect them against fruit flies. This means we can punch down those instead of pumping over. The red tank that we have, by the way, the fiberglass tanks have the capacity of about 1 ton to 1.5 tons of grapes. The red wine tank that we use for fermentation is capable of holding up to 7 tons of grapes. And any time you're fermenting reds at that volume, punch down is impossible. Therefore, that tank has to be pumped over, which is done 3 to 4 times a day for a span of about 30 minutes, making sure that the cap is always wet and always submerged under the wine in order to maximize color extraction from the skins. During this period of time, the punch down is also done, which breaks the cap and forces it into the wine, again maximizing color extraction. Now let's talk a little bit about usages of tanks. Most people automatically think that a tank is designed strictly for fermentation, but let's just go down for a minute and talk about how these tanks vary based on what's going on in the winery at any given time. You're right, the primary use of a tank is for fermentation. In our case, we ferment our white, stainless steel whites chilled, which means that we're holding temperatures at about 56 degrees rather than letting nature heat those tanks up as a byproduct of fermentation. If we didn't hold the temperatures down, the cores of these larger tanks would easily heat up to 100 to 110 degrees, rapidly accelerating fermentation and blowing many of the beautiful aromatic compounds that we have in our wine right out the top with the CO2. So therefore, we try to slow the fermentation down via coolant. Now, a byproduct of that is we can monitor sugar levels, which means that the wines that we have a hint of sweetness in is going to be natural to the grape. The Victorian White is a classic example. The 2 Chardonnays we do in the barrels are fermented to dryness. By slowing fermentation, this Chardonnay ends up with about 1% residual sugar, giving it just a nice, fresh characteristic and one that really comes nicely across in the palate on a hot day. Secondly, we have to use these tanks for racking. As we were talking a minute ago with Paula, a wine that's completely fermented, when it's done, the lees or the dead yeast cells will fall to the base of the tank. You do not want to leave wine on dead yeast cells. Over time, those yeast cells will start to break down and give a funky character to the wine. As soon as fermentation is completed, this wine will be racked from one tank to another. Sediment is then moved into carboys, or 5-gallon jugs, allowed to sail, and then the clear wine off that is moved into tanks. Sediment, of course, is then disposed of. Therefore, the wine will be as clear as we can possibly get it prior to any further processing. Another thing the tanks are used for is filtration. All of the whites that we produce have to be filtered in order to give it that real sparkle, and if you notice, it actually looks like a liquid diamond. It's so sparkling. The filtration effectively moves wine from one tank to another through a special filtration system that we use, and the filtration basically is the same filtration that's used in pharmaceutical companies to give absolute clarity and absolute perfection to pharmaceutical drugs. Another thing we have to use the tank for is stabilizing wines, which, by the way, does come before filtration. Now, what do we mean by stabilizing? Well, when a wine is produced, there are certain byproducts within that wine that can surface after bottling, one of which is tartrates, potassium tartrates. Now, the French call them wine diamonds. We in the U.S. call them potassium tartrates. One of the things I love about the French wine industry is they can come up with a romantic name for just about every problem we have in the industry. Tartrates basically will precipitate out as the temperature in the wine is dropped. Therefore, we'll hold this wine at about 27 degrees for a period of time, allowing these tartrates to crystallize, adhere to the sides of the tank. We then move the wine free of tartrates into a new tank, and now when it's bottled and you put that bottle in the refrigerator, those potassium tartrates won't crystallize in the bottle. If you ever should get a bottle with tartrates in it, regardless of what winery it is, they're not a problem. They're perfectly healthy. A lot of people are concerned about it. It's merely a byproduct of fermentation, and it will be a little bit gritty, but basically causes no problem at all with your health. Another thing we do with the tank is called heat stabilization. What we're doing now is wines have proteins that have a tendency to turn into haze if the wine bottle starts to warm up. So what we actually do is neutralize these proteins, remove them via a negative-positive proton charge. And therefore, these wines are now what we call heat stabilized. So both of the stabilization is done in stainless steel tanks during the course of processing. Of course, wine prior to bottling has to be stored, and the beauty of these tanks behind me is they're refrigerated. So we can actually hold this wine in a refrigerated state for a period of time prior to bottling. While we're doing it, the top of the tank is bathed in CO2. So again, no air will get to that wine during the course of stabilization. Finally, tanks are used for bottling. When the wine is finally completed and ready for bottling, the tank is now hooked up to the bottling line, which we talked about 2 weeks ago, and from that point on, the wine moves out of the tank and now into the bottle, the last stage of winemaking. Another thing that a lot of people don't fully understand is cleanliness of these tanks. Every tank is cleaned before and after every use. We use scalding water. If the potassium tartrates are too severe, we can use soda ash to break them down. But that results in even further cleaning, since you don't want any of that soda ash sediment in that tank prior to moving the next wine in. A lot of times the tanks are we actually climb into these tanks in order to clean them. So if you can imagine, if you're claustrophobic, that's one job that wouldn't probably be too appropriate for you. So I think when I'm saying sanitizing is priority number one when it comes to the tank room. I've got a couple of questions here.
Sure, so I'd like to begin with, you said you use it at bottling. So when you bottle wines that have been in the barrel, are you bottling straight from the barrel?
Absolutely not. That wine has been moved from the barrel into stainless steel, which gives us one last opportunity to make sure it's perfectly clear. And then it moves from stainless steel into the bottling line.
Karen Quaintance asked, is there a limit on the number of years a tank can be used?
That's the beauty of stainless steel. Unlike oak, which normally has a 6-year life expectancy, stainless steel will be used basically the lifetime of the winery. And what we do, all of our tanks, by the way, are produced and made here in the United States in West Alexandria, Ohio, by the company called Century Manufacturing, all with a very heavy gauge, 12 gauge steel. So they're very substantial tanks. As a result, they are going to hold up the lifetime of the winery.
So jumping back a little bit to our featured wine tonight, Larry Pyluk asked, the oak fermented Chardonnays have a vintage. Why is Victorian White non-vintage?
Larry, it's kind of a humorous story. When Cheryl and I were first producing it, our intent was to be able to blend vintages together based on wines that were not sold out. We've had a unique experience here. We've never had a vintage not sold out. So, for example, the wine Cheryl and I are sampling tonight is actually a 2018 Chardonnay that was picked on the same day as the previous Chardonnay that we were talking about that was barrel fermented. So basically, we could have at any given time gone with the vintage date, but quite frankly, it requires another label approval by the federal government, and I think that answers that question. Okay, last but not least, tanks are not the only thing you're going to see in a tank room. There's a number of other items that float around. You'll note directly behind me is one of our pumps. We use pumps to move wine from one tank to another. All pumps are variable speed, So it gives us the ability to slow or accelerate the movement of wine. We're also using these pumps during filtration. What I also did was pulled off a couple of the items that you saw on the tank. Stainless steel valves, all of the sanitized couplings with the O-rings that hold it in place. Of course, the airlock or the sample valves, which give us the ability to pull samples directly from the wine, from the tank. As I mentioned, gaskets, it was hard to see in the tank, but every door, every manway has a gasket similar to this, which fits like a glove. It's nothing more than a gigantic rubber band fitting around the stainless steel. When we're filtering, we're also using sample lines, so we can actually watch the clarity of the wine going from one tank to another. When we were talking about racking, all the racking is done with racking lines, which go into the wine through the manway, so we can actually pull the clear wine off of the top of the sediment without disrupting the sediment. One thing you're going to also see are stainless steel buckets. There's nothing more greater than to have a bucket so that when you're draining out of the tank, you have somewhere to put the sediment. Another thing you're going to see a lot of is the CO2 tanks. Tanks have to be filled and ready to go so that we can always maintain a neutral gas, an inert gas on top of the tanks. There's a number of other items like our filtration systems that I don't have on display, but filtering would also be a very critical element inside the tank room. Are there any other questions? Well, what I've tried to do is give you a real quick synopsis of what goes on in the tank room. It's a little more complex than a lot of people fully understand, but it's so critical to winemaking, whether you're doing it in French oak or whether you're doing it in stainless steel. At some point in time, the wine is going to find its way into a stainless steel tank. The other thing we're rather proud of is all of our tanks are closed tanks. So there are no, some tanks have what they call variable volume, where they actually have a head that floats on top of the tank. One of the reasons Cheryl and I opted not to go that route is oftentimes the gasket on those tanks will start to degenerate and air can enter those tanks. So one of the things we did is opted to go with a much more expensive style tank, but one we knew the wine would be protected. If there's no other questions, what I want to do is end today with a story kind of in honor of my son Al, who's a firefighter and has gone through a great deal during the course of this coronavirus program. There was a woman that called 911 and let the 911 operator let her know that her house was on fire. The 911 operator immediately said, "Well, what's your address?" And she said, "I'm so distraught, I can't even think straight." So the 911 operator said, "Well, then how do you expect us to get there?" And she said, "Well, don't you guys still have those big red trucks?" With that, oh, do we still have it?
Yes, I think this is a great one. Matthew Perry says, how long does it stay? So how long does wine stay in a tank versus the barrel?
Well, we know that a wine can stay in the barrel for us from 5 months up to 3 years. We do not keep wine in the tank for any length of time, mainly because the wines that are fermented in the tanks are designed to be very fruity. In fact, there's not a single drop of wine in any of these tanks behind me at this point. The room is perfectly ready for the 2020 vintage once we start harvesting. So I would say, Matthew, at most, it would be anywhere from 3 to 6 months, maybe 8 months at the most, but quite frankly, we move it out of the stainless steel as quick as it's ready to go.
Well, Al, I think you better be ready for next week because Stacy Tiley said, just wait until we all process all of this exceptional education. Next week could be ugly, Al. I think they're going to be ready with some questions for you next week.
With that, thank you all so much.
We were excited to have you here today for another edition of Happy Half Hour starring Al and Cheryl Kellert. We're really excited next week to be sharing the brand new release, 2017 Reserve Chardonnay. Oh, somebody's clapping. Also known as Stacy's House White. I see her checking in saying zing, zing, zing. And finally, this week has been brought to you by Grey Ghost Vineyards. Thanks for tuning in, guys. We always love seeing you.